The story follows Adrian Blackwell, a high-profile crime lord who rules the city's shadows from the backseat of a luxury armored car. His life is defined by cold calculations and total detachment from the ants on the street. Everything changes when Noah Rivers, a thin, desperate street kid, bypasses Adrian's terrifying enforcer, Marcus Hale, and knocks on the tinted window not to beg for money, but to ask for a single meal. Moved by a rare flicker of conscience, Adrian does the unthinkable. He brings the boy into his world. What begins as a simple meal evolves into a protective mentorship that threatens Adrian's reputation as a ruthless leader. When rival factions kidnap Noah to leverage a citywide territory war, Adrian must decide if he will remain a monster or become a savior. The final outcome sees Adrian dismantling his criminal operations to build a foundation for the city's forgotten children, forever changed by the boy who wasn't afraid to knock. The city never slept, but it knew when to hold its breath. Adrian Blackwell's armored sedan idled in the rain-slicked alley like a panther at rest, silent, predatory, patient. Inside, the air was climate-controlled perfection, 72 degrees exactly, carrying the scent of Italian leather and old money. The tinted windows turned the world outside into shadows and suggestions, a blur of neon signs reflecting off wet pavement, distant sirens wailing their futile warnings to a city that had stopped listening years ago. Adrian sat in the back seat, his tailored suit without a single crease, reviewing reports on a tablet that glowed coldly in the darkness. Territory disputes, revenue streams, the mathematics of power reduced to spreadsheets and percentages. His fingers moved across the screen with the precision of a surgeon, marking targets, approving operations, sentencing men to ruin with the tap of an index finger. Outside, the street crowd moved like ants, hurried, desperate, insignificant. They scurried past the car without looking, instinct warning them away from the predator in their midst. Adrian didn't see them as people anymore. He'd stopped doing that the same night he'd clawed his way out of the gutter and promised himself he'd never look back down. Marcus Hale stood sentry by the driver's door, 6'4" of calculated violence wrapped in an expensive coat. His eyes swept the alley in methodical arcs, cataloguing threats, dismissing the homeless huddled in doorways, the junkies stumbling between dumpsters. The wolves knew to keep the sheep away from the shepherd's car. Then came the sound that changed everything. Thumpy, thumpy, thumpy. Small, hollow, rhythmic. A child's fist against bulletproof glass. Adrian's finger paused mid-swipe. The knocking continued, patient and desperate all at once, a rhythm that suggested the child knew this might be their only chance. Marcus moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his hand already inside his coat. Through the tinted window, Adrian watched his enforcer approach the small figure, a boy, maybe 10 years old, all jutting angles and hollow cheeks beneath a layer of grime that made him almost indistinguishable from the wet pavement. The boy didn't run. That was the first surprise. Most people fled when Marcus Hale took a step in their direction. This child simply looked up, craning his neck to meet the enforcer's eyes, his small fist still raised as if he might knock again on the air itself. Adrian pressed the intercom button. Wait. Marcus froze, his expression flickering with confusion for just a fraction of a second before the professional mask returned. He stepped aside, and Adrian found himself staring at the smudge of dirt on his pristine window where small fingers had dared to touch. The boy's voice came muffled through the glass, thin and trembling but not begging. Please, sir, I'm not asking for money, I'm just so hungry, just one meal, that's all. Adrian had heard 1,000 pleas in his life. He'd learned to let them wash over him like rain on steel, meaningless and forgotten, but something in the boy's voice, the careful dignity in his desperation, the way he asked for so little when he clearly needed everything, made Adrian's hand move to the window control. The glass descended with a whisper of expensive engineering. What's your name? Adrian heard himself ask. The boy blinked as if he'd expected anything but a question. Noah, sir, Noah Rivers. Adrian studied him for a long moment, the dirt-caked clothes that had once been blue, the shoes held together with duct tape, the eyes that were far too old for such a young face. He saw something in those eyes that he recognized, something that whispered of survival and stubborn hope despite every reason to surrender. Get in the car, Noah Rivers. Marcus's sharp intake of breath was audible. The boy hesitated, survival instinct warring with hunger, before he reached for the door handle with shaking fingers. The restaurant's maitre d' went pale when Adrian Blackwell walked through the door with a street child in tow. La Mer Rouge was the kind of establishment where senators made deals and CEOs celebrated victories, where a single meal cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. The crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across white tablecloths and silver, so polished it could serve as mirrors. Conversation died like a candle flame in wind as heads turned, tracking the crime lord's progress through the dining room. Noah walked beside Adrian with wide eyes, his dirty sneakers silent on the thick carpet, his presence a jarring note in the symphony of wealth. He kept his hands close to his sides, as if afraid to touch anything in this palace of glass and gold. "Your usual table, Mr. Blackwell," the maitre d' managed, his professional composure reassembling itself with visible effort. "Yes, and bring the boy whatever he wants." Adrian watched as Noah stared at the menu, his lips moving silently as he worked through the French descriptions. The waiter hovered uncertain until Noah looked up with quiet determination. "Could I have the steak, and the soup and maybe some bread?" He paused, then added in a smaller voice, "Please." "Bring him all 3 courses," Adrian said. "Everything on the menu if he wants it." What followed was a meal that would be whispered about in the city's shadows for years to come. The ruthless Adrian Blackwell, the Shadow King who'd built an empire on blood and fear, sat in perfect silence and watched a starving child eat. He didn't check his phone, didn't review his reports, didn't look away when Noah's hands shook so badly with hunger that he could barely hold the fork, or when tears rolled down the boy's cheeks as he tasted real food for what might have been the first time in weeks. The other diners pretended not to stare, but Adrian felt their eyes, their judgment, their confusion. Let them wonder, let them talk. When Noah finally pushed back from the table, his stomach full for the first time in memory, he looked at Adrian with something like wonder. "Thank you, sir, I'll never forget this, never." Adrian signaled for the check, his expression unreadable. "Where do you sleep, Noah?" The boy's gaze dropped. "Wherever it's safe, sir, under the overpass mostly, sometimes the shelter if there's room." "Not tonight," Adrian said, making a decision that would unravel everything he'd built. "Tonight you sleep somewhere warm." 3 weeks passed, and the city held its breath, waiting for the Shadow King to remember who he was. Noah had become a fixture in Adrian's world, a ghost haunting the edges of criminal enterprise, sitting quietly in the corner of the armored sedan, while Adrian conducted business, eating breakfast at the penthouse table, while Marcus reviewed security reports. The boy asked few questions and offered no complaints, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the dream and return him to the cold streets. But Adrian watched him, watched the way Noah studied everything with hungry eyes, not the hunger of the stomach now, but the hunger of a mind starved for knowledge, for understanding, for a future that extended beyond the next meal. The boy was sharp, intuitive in ways that reminded Adrian of himself at that age, the age when he'd realized that survival meant learning to read the world's hidden languages. "Why did you knock on my window?" Adrian asked one evening as they sat in his office, the city's lights spreading below them like fallen stars. Noah looked up from the book Adrian had given him, a history of the city, filled with stories of men who'd risen from nothing. "Because you were the only one who looked like you could help, sir." "I'm not a good man, Noah, you understand that." The boy nodded slowly. "I know what people say about you, but bad men don't feed hungry kids, bad men don't care." "Maybe I'm just bored," Adrian said, testing him. "No, sir," Noah's voice was quiet but certain. "You see me, most people they look right through kids like me, we're invisible but you see me." Adrian felt something crack in his chest, a fissure in the armor he'd spent decades forging. He saw himself in Noah, the frightened boy he'd been before he learned to bury fear so deep it could never surface. The desperate child who'd knocked on different doors, metaphorically speaking, until he'd finally kicked them down himself. "You're too smart for the streets," Adrian said finally, "too smart to waste." "What are you going to do with me?" Noah asked, and for the first time there was something like hope in his voice. Adrian stood walking to the window, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "I don't know yet, but you're not going back to that overpass." Behind him, Marcus cleared his throat. "Boss, the rivals are talking. They're saying you've gone soft, that the boy is a weakness." Adrian turned, his eyes cold as winter. "Then let them talk, and let them remember what happens to people who test me." But even as he said it, he knew Marcus was right. In their world, weakness was blood in the water, and the sharks were already circling. The photograph arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under the door of Adrian's office building in an unmarked envelope. It showed Noah laughing, captured through a telephoto lens as Marcus walked him to the library 3 blocks from the penthouse. The boy's face was bright with an expression Adrian had worked hard to put there: joy, security, the radical notion that tomorrow might be better than today. There was no note, none was needed. Adrian studied the image with the cold calculation that had made him the city's most dangerous man, but his hands, resting flat on the mahogany desk, trembled almost imperceptibly. Marcus stood at attention across from him, his jaw tight with controlled fury. "The Kozlov crew," Marcus said. "Has to be, they've been pushing into our territory for months and they know," he stopped, choosing his words carefully, "they know how to hurt you now." Adrian set the photograph down with deliberate care. "Double Noah's security detail. I want eyes on him every second. He doesn't go anywhere without at least 3 men. Boss, with respect, maybe it's time to consider other options. We could send him somewhere safe, out of the city, somewhere they can't." "No," the word came out harder than Adrian intended. He forced his voice level. "He stays where I can protect him." But protection, Adrian knew, was an illusion in his world. He'd built his empire on the understanding that everyone had a weakness, everyone had something they'd bleed for. He'd weaponized that knowledge against dozens of rivals, exploiting loves and loyalties until his enemies crumbled. Now someone was using his own strategy against him. The realization that he cared, truly cared, about Noah's fate was almost worse than the threat itself. Caring was the luxury of ordinary men, men who didn't have rivals circling like wolves, men whose affections didn't paint targets on the backs of everyone they loved. Loved, the word hit him like a physical blow. He'd loved nothing and no one for 20 years, had considered it a point of pride, the ultimate evolution of his survival instinct. But somewhere between that first knock on his window and this moment, Noah Rivers had slipped past every defense, had found the human being Adrian thought he'd killed long ago. "Increase security on all our operations," Adrian ordered, his voice steady now, sliding back into the role of the Shadow King. "I want to know what the Kozlovs are planning before they plan it. And Marcus, send them a message, make it clear." Marcus nodded, understanding perfectly. In their language, messages were written in blood. But as his enforcer left to carry out the orders, Adrian picked up the photograph again, studying Noah's smile. For the first time in decades, he felt something he'd forgotten existed. Fear. The call came at 3:47 p.m., interrupting a meeting with 3 city councilmen who'd grown comfortable in Adrian's pocket. Marcus's voice was tight, controlled, but Adrian heard the edge of panic underneath. "Boss, he's gone." Adrian was moving before his mind fully processed the words. The councilmen forgotten, their startled protests fading behind him as he strode from the conference room. His driver had the sedan running by the time he reached street level, and Marcus was standing beside it, his face carved from stone. "Tell me," Adrian said. "Library, we were following protocol, Chen and Rodriguez inside, Dimitri on the street, me coordinating from the car. Noah went to the bathroom. When he didn't come out after 5 minutes, Chen went in." Marcus's hands clenched into fists. Window was open, 3-story drop to the alley, rope still tied to the sink. Cameras. Disabled, professional job, they'd been planning this. Adrian climbed into the back seat, his mind already running through scenarios, probabilities, chess moves on a board that had suddenly tilted toward chaos. "Where's the car now?" "Your garage, we didn't want to leave it at the scene." When they arrived, Adrian's stomach dropped. The passenger door stood open, hanging like a broken wing. On the leather seat, Noah's seat, lay a single playing card, the ace of spades, in the Russian criminal tradition a death card. Taped to it was a note in blocky handwriting. "The boy for Eastport, you have 48 hours, come alone or he dies slowly." Adrian stared at the card, at the empty seat, at the space where Noah should have been. The city sounds faded, traffic, sirens, the endless urban hum, until all he could hear was his own heartbeat, steady and cold as a metronome counting down to violence. "Eastport is Kozlov's strongest territory," Marcus said quietly. "Warehouses, shipping containers, a dozen places to hide a hostage, if you walk in there alone." "Then I walk in alone." "Boss, it's a trap, they're not going to trade, they'll kill you both." Adrian turned to face his oldest friend, his most loyal soldier, and Marcus actually took a step back from whatever he saw in Adrian's eyes. I didn't claw my way out of the gutter to become the kind of man who lets a child die because of mathematics and probabilities, Adrian said, his voice soft and more terrifying for it. Noah knocked on my window because he had nowhere else to go. He trusted me, and I will burn this entire city to ash before I let him down. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts he'd never thought he'd use. What are you doing? Marcus asked. Calling in every favor I'm owed, and some I'm not. He paused, his finger hovering over a name. I'm calling the police. Marcus's eyes widened. Boss, that's suicide, perhaps, but Noah doesn't have 48 hours. You know as well as I do that the deadline is a fiction. They took him to draw me out, but they have no reason to keep him alive once they have what they want. Adrian pressed dial. So we change the game, we flip the board, we make them realize they've made a mistake they can't survive. The phone rang once, twice, then a gruff voice answered, Detective Morrison. Detective, this is Adrian Blackwell. I have information about a kidnapping, and I'm ready to make a deal. The police precinct fell silent when Adrian Blackwell walked through the door, flanked by Marcus and his attorney. Detective Sarah Morrison met them in the lobby, her grey eyes sharp with suspicion and barely concealed disgust. She'd been trying to build a case against Adrian for 5 years, chasing shadows and dead-end leads, while he stayed untouchable behind walls of lawyers and legitimate businesses that laundered his empire. Now he was walking into her house voluntarily. This is unexpected, she said, her voice dry. Should I be checking for horsemen of the apocalypse? A child's life is at stake, detective. I'm willing to set aside our differences temporarily. Morrison studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward the conference room. Talk. Adrian laid out the situation with clinical precision. Noah's background, the photograph, the kidnapping, the Kozlov organization's involvement. He left nothing out except the parts that would incriminate himself directly. It was a masterclass in strategic confession, giving just enough truth to be useful while admitting nothing that could be prosecuted. So let me understand this, Morrison said when he finished. You, the Shadow King of this city, are asking the police to help you rescue a street kid you've known for less than a month. And in exchange for our assistance, you're offering what exactly? Adrian slid a USB drive across the table. Everything, financial records, names, addresses, enough evidence to dismantle the Kozlov operation completely, and, he paused, meeting her eyes. When this is over, I'll retire, disappear, you'll never see me again. The room went still. Morrison picked up the drive, turning it over in her hands. You're really willing to give up your empire for one kid? I'm willing to give up everything to make sure he grows up to have a choice I never did, Adrian said simply. I spent 20 years becoming a monster so I'd never have to feel powerless again, but Noah reminded me what it's like to be human, and humans protect the people he stopped, the word love catching in his throat. The people who matter. Morrison's expression softened fractionally. She had children of her own, Adrian had done his homework. The moment we move on the Kozlovs, they'll know someone talked, they'll kill the boy immediately. Unless we're already inside, Adrian said. I'm the bait they want, I'll walk in. You give me a 30-minute head start, then you come in heavy. SWAT every unit you can spare, but I find Noah first. That's not a plan, that's suicide. Adrian smiled, and it was the expression that had made hardened criminals cross the street to avoid him. Detective, I've been preparing for suicide missions my entire life. The difference is, this time I have something worth dying for. Morrison looked at her captain, at the USB drive, at Adrian's face. Then she made the decision that would either save a child or end with bodies in a warehouse. 30 minutes, she said, not a second more, and Blackwell, if this is some elaborate play, if you're using us, then you'll have enough evidence on that drive to bury me forever, Adrian finished. I'm done being the Shadow King, detective. One way or another, tonight it ends. The warehouse squatted at the edge of Eastport like a rusted monument to the city's industrial decay, surrounded by shipping containers that formed a maze of corrugated steel. Adrian approached alone as instructed, his hands visible, his expensive coat fluttering in the salt-tinged wind from the harbor. Behind him, 30 minutes away by stopwatch, Morrison was assembling her forces. Ahead, in the darkness between the containers, he felt eyes tracking his movement. They let him reach the warehouse entrance before Victor Kozlov stepped from the shadows, flanked by 6 men with automatic weapons. The great Adrian Blackwell, Victor said, his accent thick with Moscow streets. Walking into death with open arms, the boy must be special. Where is he? Victor smiled, gold teeth glinting. First we talk business. Eastport is ours now. You agree, sign the territories over to my organization, then maybe we discuss the boy. No, Adrian's voice was flat. You release Noah unharmed and I'll sign anything you want, but I see him alive first. A tense moment passed, Victor weighing options, calculating odds. Then he nodded to one of his men who disappeared into the warehouse. 2 minutes later, 2 minutes Adrian counted in heartbeats, Noah stumbled out, his hands zip-tied, a bruise darkening his cheek but alive. Their eyes met across 20 feet of concrete, and Adrian saw fear there but also something else. Trust. Noah trusted him to fix this, to make it right, the way he'd made everything right since that first knock on a tinted window. Now we trade, Victor said, pulling a gun and pressing it to Noah's temple. You sign or I paint the walls with his brains. Adrian had spent 20 years learning to calculate odds, to read situations, to know when to fold and when to go all in. He'd built an empire on being smarter, faster, more ruthless than everyone else. But standing there, watching Noah's terrified face, he realized that all his calculations meant nothing against the simple mathematics of a child's life. All right, he said, reaching slowly for the papers Victor's lawyer held. You win. But as he moved, as Victor's attention focused on the contract, Adrian's hand shifted trajectory. He'd learned to shoot before he'd learned to read, had spent thousands of hours on ranges and in situations where hesitation meant death. The movement was fluid, practiced, inevitable. The gunshot cracked through the air like thunder. Victor's men reacted instantly, weapons rising, but Marcus and 3 of Adrian's best had been positioned in the containers since dawn, waiting for exactly this moment. Chaos erupted, muzzle flashes in the darkness, men shouting, the sharp reports of gunfire echoing off steel walls. Adrian was already moving, diving for Noah, his body becoming a shield as bullets tore through the air where he'd been standing. He crashed into the boy, rolling them both behind a concrete pillar as the world exploded into violence around them. Close your eyes, Adrian commanded, and Noah obeyed, burying his face against Adrian's chest while death danced outside their shelter. The firefight lasted 90 seconds. When the silence fell, Victor lay dead, his empire crumbling around him. And then, right on schedule, the night lit up with red and blue as Morrison's unit stormed the warehouse, SWAT teams pouring through every entrance like an avenging flood. Adrian held Noah tighter, feeling the boy's heartbeat against his own, both of them alive against all odds. I've got you, Adrian whispered. I've got you and I'm never letting go. 6 months later, the city barely recognized the man who'd once been its shadow king. Adrian Blackwell, the name remained though everything else had transformed, stood outside Riverside Elementary, watching through the chain-link fence as children played during recess. Noah was among them, his laugh carrying across the playground, his face fuller now, healthier, bright with the uncomplicated joy of a child who'd been given a second chance. The boy spotted him and waved, then returned to his game of tag, secure in the knowledge that Adrian would be there when the bell rang, that someone was watching over him, that he mattered. Adrian waved back, a gesture that would have been unthinkable in his previous life. True to his word, he'd retired from the criminal world. His empire had been carefully dismantled, his operations either shut down or handed over to Morrison's task force. The USB drive had contained enough evidence to send 27 people to prison, none of them Adrian, as negotiated. The penthouse had been sold, the armored sedan donated to a private security museum. Adrian lived now in a modest brownstone in a neighborhood where people smiled at strangers and children played in the streets without fear. But he hadn't disappeared entirely. The fortune he'd accumulated, cleaned, legitimized, filtered through lawyers and accountants until it was legally unassailable, had been transformed into the Rivers Foundation, named after the boy who'd knocked on his window and changed everything. The foundation focused on the city's forgotten children, the ones who lived under overpasses and slept in doorways, the ones the world looked through as if they were invisible. It provided meals, shelters, education, and most importantly, it provided what Adrian had given Noah, the radical notion that they mattered, that someone saw them, that their lives had value beyond survival. Marcus had stayed with him, trading his role as enforcer for something softer, head of security for the foundation, protector of children rather than criminal interests. They never spoke about the old days, about the empire they'd built and abandoned. Some doors once closed stayed closed. The school bell rang, and Noah came running, his backpack bouncing, his smile wide. He'd put on 20 pounds, grown 3 inches, and started talking about becoming a lawyer someday, someone who could help people the way Adrian had helped him. "How was school?" Adrian asked, falling into the rhythm of their daily routine. "Great, I got an A on my math test. And Noah's expression grew serious. "We're supposed to bring our parents to career day next week. I know you're not technically my dad, but I was wondering if maybe you could come, tell them about the foundation." Adrian felt something warm spread through his chest, filling spaces that had been cold and empty for decades. He'd never imagined himself as a father, had considered it impossible for a man like him. But Noah had taught him that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building something better with whatever future remained. "I'd be honored," Adrian said, and he meant it with every atom of his being. They walked home together through streets Adrian had once ruled from the backseat of an armored car, but now traversed on foot like any other citizen. People nodded hello, knowing him as the philanthropist, the guardian, the man who'd built something beautiful from the ruins of his former life. As they turned the corner toward home, Noah slipped his hand into Adrian's, a gesture of trust and affection that still had the power to stop Adrian's breath. "You know what's weird," Noah said. "Sometimes I think about that night I knocked on your window. What if you hadn't stopped? What if you'd just driven away like everyone else?" Adrian squeezed the boy's hand gently. "But I didn't." "Why?" Noah asked, looking up with those eyes that had seen too much darkness but somehow still held light. "Why did you stop?" Adrian thought about it, about all the calculations and rationalizations he'd constructed in the months since. But in the end, the truth was simpler than any of that. "Because you knocked," he said. "Because you had the courage to ask for help, and I had just enough humanity left to answer. You saved me as much as I saved you, Noah, maybe more." They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, a reformed criminal and the street kid who'd reminded him what it meant to be human, both of them forever changed by a single moment of mercy in a world that so rarely offered second chances. Behind them, the city continued its endless rhythm, but for Adrian Blackwell, the symphony had changed. He was no longer the Shadow King, ruling from darkness. He was simply a man who'd been given an unexpected gift, the chance to protect instead of prey upon, to build instead of destroy, to love instead of fear. And every day, when Noah knocked on his door after school, eager to share stories about homework and friends and the beautiful mundane details of a normal childhood, Adrian remembered why he'd given up everything. Some knocks, it turned out, were worth answering, no matter the cost.